The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television.
Hello and welcome to Compass, a production from Pioneer Public Television. I'm Les Heen, your host for Compass, and this is a weekly discussion of public policy and important issues facing our viewing area. This week we will discuss the ever-growing farm-to-table movement in both rural and metro areas. We will touch on what kind of harvest expectations and benefits farmers see, as well as the kind of farm-to-table setups that are in our region. First, we have the story of how an Alexandria restaurant was established, and it's grown because of their farm-to-table setup. We will also introduce you to the chef who is behind the fresh food artistry. Here's Pioneer's Laura K. Prosser with the story.
Farm to fork isn't just something farmers practice with their produce at the dinner table, and it's not just something schools do to subsidize their food. This week I'll be bringing you not only to a restaurant that practices the farm to fork etiquette, but also to a local event called Farm Feast that celebrates the movement. Take a look.
La ferme is French for the farm, and was a concept that started about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, when I was fresh out of culinary school. As most culinary students have a dream, so did I, of owning my own restaurant in the heartland of where, to me, good food comes from. We have some of the best soil to grow the best vegetables. With that best soil also comes the grasses, the prairie grasses that we have here that my cattle are raised on, and my sheep are raised on, and my goats. And so, it all comes back down to having the best soil, and out of that you get the best ingredients all the way around for the whole plate for me. The thing that I tell people all the time is that it's not me that made that dish. All I did was heat the food up and gave it to you. It's the farmers that put the hard work into creating all of that. And so farm to fork was, a phrase that really seems to fit with that kind of a mentality with food.
Now, not all chefs have the skills to create a dialogue between restaurant kitchens and the farmers in the field. But, as a locally grown boy, Matt doesn't seem to have such problems, and finds his kitchen stocked by multiple different farms.
You meet one farmer, well, they have a friend that specializes in microgreens, and then that friend has a friend who specializes in something else. And so it's just been kind of a slow process of creating this web of farmers that can help support a restaurant, because it does take quite a bit. There are about 22 different farms, I believe, right now that are in our web. And we have people who grow chickens. I have a farmer who grows specialty fowl, which is guinea, goose, duck, quail. That same farmer also does quail eggs for me. I have a farmer for beef, pork, and then every kind of vegetable. And each vegetable has really become someone who has to be growing just that vegetable for me because of the quantity that we're going to go through. My first year here, I can remember, a farmer coming in and saying, "Hey, I grow tomatoes." "Well, that's great. I will start taking your tomatoes." And after week one, I'm ordering about 4 dozen tomatoes a week. And after week one, they come to me and, "I have no more tomatoes. I had no idea that you would go through that many tomatoes." I'm like, yeah, it's a restaurant. We go through a lot of tomatoes.
Unlike some restaurants, it's not just whatever is in stock is used at La Ferme. It's whatever's available through that web that dictates the menu.
It's a lot of phone calls to my farmers of, "What do you got available today?" Or in the next couple days, what am I going to have to work with? And so then I start writing the recipe around those ingredients. I have to be a little bit fancy when I'm cooking just because that's what I love to do in that whole sculpting process. You start drawing on the plate and creating a sculpture for a person, and it's just an amazing thing to give somebody, it might be the same ingredients, but each dish that goes out looks great, but it's going to be different, minutely. And then for a person to eat that and then come to you and say that that was one of the best things they've ever eaten in their life you can't put words to that. Beyond rewarding.
Rewarding doesn't even describe it, especially when you get to present farm-to-fork food right on the farm itself, which is exactly what Farm Feast in Windham, Minnesota is all about for those that get to join.
2 years ago, I came to Maury with this idea of having a meal at the farm because I wanted to kind of showcase the beauty of Minnesota that time of year and the bounty of the harvest and the things that we've been working on up there. And so Maury and I planned this meal and took it from there.
Farm Feast is a wonderful event where I get to work with an awesome local grower and prepare food at its freshest and most pure. And we get to have that feast right in the garden that it came from. I like to use recipes and use Matt's food in a way that maybe most people in our area wouldn't necessarily use it.
My whole goal here is to really open people's eyes to the wonderful things that we can do with what's growing here in this garden.
It's all really good.
I really wanted to give people a new idea on how to use these sorts of foods and incorporate them in everyday life instead of just for canning or just for things that you would necessarily just think of when it comes to foods.
The first year they got their feet wet and kept it small, but as the community's positive response grew, so did the event, and it began to bring awareness of local food options to the community.
So to have the public come up there and see that this kind of thing exists in their community has really been a boon. It's brought more people to the market. It's raised awareness of local foods. I think it's easy when you shop in the grocery store all the time to forget that there's other options in the community. So the feast has been a good way to bring that into people's minds.
I would say that the education piece is not only tasting the food, but being in the very place where it came from. And I think, before the feast starts, there's a lot of people that tour the garden and just look at all of the different things that are there. And I think just having us there among the vegetables is education itself. It's a wonderful thing to be a part of. In rural America, we're farmers, especially southwestern Minnesota. We come from a farming community, and this is the kind of farming that, even growing up in a rural area, that I didn't know existed. And so it's even education for myself. And I think that that's been such an awesome evolution of just seeing where farming is going at this point and how we can use it as a community of people. And I'm hoping that more things like this do surface.
And with us now to talk about the farm-to-table regional influence, we have Doug Peterson, who is the president of the Minnesota Farmers Union, and also with him is Ann Schweigel, who is an owner and operator with her husband of Prairie Point Farms near Browns Valley. Doug, Ann, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
I'm going to love having this conversation because everybody loves food, right? And we're talking about food, we're talking about farms, and we're talking about our viewing area. And of course, all through the upper Midwest, this is what people are really talking about, I think, when they get excited about farms and food. So, but let's start with some definitions. I mean, Doug, you've been working at this for a long time. What is farm to table? When you think of that, what does it really mean?
Well, that means, I go back to when I was a kid, out of the garden, onto the table. It was fresh lettuce. It was eaten that day, the radishes, the strawberries, the apples, those kinds of things, even the asparagus in the ditches. Wild asparagus, that's kind of all the thing. And then the other issue is it's just not fruit and vegetables, there's also meat and those kinds of produces. When you're on the farm, years back you were able to process your own your animals and take it to the locker, and you had fresh and pretty good quality. We've moved because of different societal changes, but there seems to be now an emphasis of farm fresh food is coming back, and where it's sourced, where it comes from, and what's the story behind the food. Food is terribly personal. It's a choice that you make 3 times a day, in my case, many times more than that. But it really is not necessarily a lifestyle, and in some cases, I think people should have the access to fresh produce, and there's a lot of policy implications as to how we incentivize. We've got the commodity markets, traditional markets, traditional wheat, corn, and soybeans, and those things, and those are always going to be with us. But there has to be some choice out there for people, and we support, the policy that supports rural farm families, farmers or ranchers throughout all of America, Minnesota. And we always say that buy it locally, buy it regionally. If not, then buy it from the United States. Check, and if you can't do that, then check the label, see where it's from. And I think if you do that, you're going to enjoy fresh food. It's not only about just a local economy, but really, if the nation feeds itself, you have a lot of national security. Sure. And now we're starting to talk in the legislative process about nutrition. And Ann, you may know a little bit about that nutritional aspect of providing food for rural people and urban and suburban dwellers. There seems to be issues where not everybody has the same access. Sure. We talked about food deserts.
Food deserts in urban areas, right? Yeah. And in your case, Ann, of course, as a farmer, and we should mention Browns Valley for people who don't know the viewing area very well. That's, shall we say, just the bump on the side of the state is the simplest way.
At the tip of the bump.
At the tip of the bump.
In the tip of the bump, I can see South Dakota from my back window.
Yeah. So for you, as a farmer, what does farm to table mean to you?
Farm to table to me means that I can source. I can take a look at what's on my plate and say, this pork, in my instance, came off of my farm. The greens came from maybe a deep winter greenhouse in Milan. And I can point to what's on the table and kind of know where that came from and have a deeper connection to my food other than that came from the grocery store. And for me, Doug touched on it a lot. I farm in Big Stone County, and that's a USDA designated food desert. People don't have to drive further distances to get their fresh food. And so as a producer, part of my goal with my husband is to keep as much as what we produce as local as we can. So we sell some of our pork to the local food co-op in Ortonville and the other natural food store in Morris, Pomme de Terre. So we sell to the granary in Pomme de Terre. As an effort to kind of just keep that circle a little bit smaller, and you see the effect of it with other local producers and keeping more money in your local economy.
And it's interesting, you both mentioned the sort of the food desert idea, and that's a concept where we've heard more about it in recent years, particularly for urban communities. But there are also areas in rural areas where I guess we could say that you may have to travel farther, or the distance between where you are and a commonly accessible and affordable source for good food isn't really there. Is that a fair definition in both cases?
That's fair. Years ago, we didn't have that problem because we had population, we had service, transportation, those kinds of things. Now our food on the plate today travels at least 1,500 miles. A carbon footprint, not so good. Greenhouse gases, not so good. So when you start talking about access to food, it now has moved to the realm of do you have food security? And when you start talking about children in this country and also in rural areas, 20% of our kids are hungry. 20% of our population is food insecure, meaning going to the grocery shelf in their cupboard and not having any food. And that is now moving to some of the poorer areas, and I'm not saying that we're poor, but we've been identified in rural areas because of the issue of age, the issue of poverty, and the issue of more rural women and older rural women now become the targets of this insecurity that is now starting to creep up. So when you start talking about farm to table or farm fresh food that's nutritional So you can add nutritional value. And then if you start really pegging this thing in, start looking at the diabetes and some of the other issues that we have, all of a sudden it's not pandemic, but we have diabetes that is just the number one issue right now for how people eat and where we're going with things when it comes to food policy. It's important.
Well, and there was just a report I heard the other day about, as you look at broader food policy issues, the diabetes was often thought of as being a serious growing issue in countries that were more affluent, and now what we're seeing worldwide, I think, is that you're seeing an increase in diabetes in countries that are not necessarily considered affluent, and that's because they're not necessarily getting some of the locally grown foods or the things that were not processed, and it was a very different environment.
Well, go ahead, Jan.
I was going to say access to clean water, and then they have to rely on things like sugary drinks, and that spikes your rates of diabetes and obesity.
Yeah, and so I think for the local food movement, in the case of for farmers, it's a farm-to-table thing, and then for consumers, wherever they are, I think one thing that I know, Doug, you've talked about in the past is when we've had conversations is taste.
Oh, yeah. No.
And that, growing up on the farm, as you and I did, and as many people did, we used to say, well, I can tell that this is the beef that came out of our farm because it tastes different, or it's what we grew up on the farm or came out of the garden and it tastes different. Yeah. So there are different reasons. For some people it's taste, for some people it's understanding where it's grown, for other people it's health. So there are seems to be a lot of reasons why people are coming to this movement now.
There's enough of a market out there that everybody can get food. It's the access piece. I mean, how do you access good, healthy food when you're in an urban area where there's no grocery stores? Or take that out into rural areas, rural counties in northwest Minnesota, northeast, wherever. When you look at the larger stores coming in and crowding out the smaller grocery stores. A grocery store, I believe I was told the other day, if you have a grocery store in town, it has to have about 7 to 80% of the people in that town buying their groceries at that store. It's going to fail. So now we've moved these people to a different place, and those people that can't drive, can't get out, that aren't partaking in Meals on Wheels or senior nutrition, and it really targets, like I said before, women, children, and the elderly. Those are the targets that we need to really look at as far as farm fresh, healthy food, and then food access. And that has a lot of policy implications. The last Farm Bill started looking at some of those things. The president's wife, Michelle Obama, the issue on changing the food, the old food triangle, everybody remembers the food triangle. Now it changed to the plate. There's a lot of resistance to that. But, I've always been of the opinion that it's a pretty big market out there. If you give people the opportunity and the ramp to success, and they want to work hard, they're going to put that food out there. They're going to make themselves a success. But without that opportunity and without having the boot of unfair trade practices or other things that we could get into and talk about ad nauseum, you need to have level playing fields, but at the same time, given the fair opportunity, people are going to choose family farming and agriculture over a lot of businesses. You start seeing that. People are coming back, but if you're going to come back into conventional, and your listeners know that, coming back to conventional, it's a $200,000 combine.
Right.
Tough. And I think, Ann, you have, on your farm, you're more traditional too.
Yeah, we do a diversified non-GMO grain operation as well as our pastured pork, which is relatively small scale. We have to keep up the grain operation. It's farmed conventionally, but we grow non-GMO corn, food-grade beans, wheat, barley, field peas, and alfalfa. And we take that grain, those non-traditional grains, and we have a feed mill on farm, and we grind it up and feed it to our niche market so that we know from seed to finish what goes into our product. And what I wanted to say off your access point, Doug, was that bought in season, seasonal fresh produce is often much cheaper than buying things that are from local sources. Sure. Local farmers markets is often much less expensive than buying it, off a truck that came in from who knows where, and who picked it and who was paid for that. You're paying a local producer then a fair wage, and they can charge what they deem is a fair wage for that.
It's sort of like the argument we heard before about the 500-mile tomato or the 1,000-mile tomato and the backyard tomato. And of course, for a lot of people who are gardeners, they've had this sensitivity about their tomatoes for years, right? They want their backyard tomato. But that same principle can apply to a great many other things. But people might not necessarily make the same distinction with asparagus or other things that are seasonal. I mean, they have their particular things that they have in the garden, and they understand the qualitative difference. But it seems to me that for chefs, we haven't talked about chefs much, but for a lot of chefs who are really moving into this area, that's a huge concern for them is what's the quality and what's the difference and how far did it travel to get there? Because distance often equals freshness.
Yeah, absolutely. My husband and I say this all the time, but part of the reason we moved home to farm, we both pursued other careers for several years after we finished college. And we wanted to move home so that we could eat like kings. We grow some of our own vegetables. I've proven to be a farmer who can't grow a vegetable to save herself. But we support local farmers markets and raise our own meat and barter for eggs and chicken, and it ends up being we eat so well as a result, and we part of it could be the emotional connection to the food that there's a big sense and pride of growing something with an end use instead of being dumped into the commodity market. The beans we grow have an end use purpose. They become fermented soy products. And there's a big sense of pride in growing something with an actual purpose that you can point to and say, the pork that I raised, that's being sold now. Those 6 pigs have been now sold to friends and family, and they're enjoying that, and that has an actual purpose to it. And there's a big pride for us in that.
Yeah, it strikes me too when I've talked to farmers who have just made the sort of choices that you've made, is that there's an excitement about what they're doing because they're discovering relationships, they're discovering stories, they're building relationships with other people within their community or in some cases away from their community, and that's making their experience as a farmer seems to be richer for them because there's a story there.
Well, I think the issue on stories is I don't care if you're a small CSA farmer, raising fruits and vegetables and meat for customers in a smaller situation. They've got a story to tell, and they market that story. It's no different than looking at the orange juice and reading the story of Joe and Sally Farmer in Florida about how they are. And then you start looking at the marketing aspect of telling the story and making it a wholesome story because food is so personal. You can go have your sloppy joes at the ball game and enjoy that, but food's a pretty big deal, in most people's lives. It sustains you. It also it talks about really who you are as a person, and all this stuff's got to taste good. And I like good food. I think it's but it's interesting. We just had some meetings throughout Minnesota, and one of our members up in Hollick, Minnesota, came home, much like your story. After 10 years, he and his wife decided to get off the corporate circus merry-go-round and come home and start farming.
That's not fulfilling.
Yeah.
I don't know why. That just wasn't fulfilling.
You become a number versus a real individual.
Absolutely.
But that number thing, you're a real individual in rural Minnesota, and you can work for yourself. I mean, there's real distinctions why people are still here. But to finish the story is this guy came home with his wife, and they started a distillery. And it's Far North Spirits, and it's 13 miles from the Canadian border, so far north.
Far north, yeah.
And we were up there and listened to their story. And what's selling their spirits in this distillery is the fact that they have a story to tell. It's their own food that they're raising, and it's on their family farm. And for the consumers or the people that make that choice on that particular type of spirit, that is how they're marketing. And it's working out for them. They've been in it for 2 years. Not to say it's not going to be hard to make it, because there's a lot of people doing craft breweries and all of those kinds of things. But we've really kind of come of age. We started out with Minnesota Cooks 14 years ago, and you were right there when we started the darn thing, and we stayed the course. A lot of people came into Local Foods and they left because it wasn't going very good. But there, we've moved a lot of this from kind of the shishi chefs,
sure,
and and made it mainstream. And we've invited in not only urban and suburban but rural people. Mm-hmm. So we have a good mix of rural people that are now, and chefs and restaurants that are now using local food, where they didn't do that 14 years ago. And we also moved institutions, the institutions of Rochester Mayo Hospital being there, talking about sourcing nutritional food for their patients. Colleges, University of Minnesota Morris, University of Minnesota at Duluth, and the Minneapolis and St. Paul campuses, schools, Bloomington schools. I mean, it's moving, and not to say it's going to replace 100% of all of the food. It's not going to.
No.
We got about a minute left here, so just want to check. If people want to know more about local food, Ann, in your case, in your area, suggestions about what people should do to find local food in their area.
To find local food.
Farmers markets?
Yeah, go to your first local farmers market. They're now becoming in almost even small towns in Big Stone County have their own farmers markets, which is really awesome to see.
And we've got Minnesota Farmers Union, that's mfu.org, and then look up Minnesota Cooks, or just get a hold of us on the web. And there's opportunity. I think the big story here is there's opportunity for people of all sizes of farms, small, medium, and large, to live in rural Minnesota.
There is.
As an economic unit, and that means an economy that provides sustainability.
Mm-hmm. There is. Doug Peterson, Ann Schwegel, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this week on Compass. Join us next week for more people, places, and issues facing our region. Thanks.